The Christmas ball at the gallery was in full swing, glittering lights casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed crowd. I had been looking forward to this night for weeks, eager to support Tracy in what was one of the biggest events of her career. But as I stood by the bar, nursing my whiskey, I couldn't help but notice that she was spending far too much time with Jackson Fairchild. Jackson was a well-known philanthropist, one of those men who seemed to command attention effortlessly. Tall, silver-haired, with a charisma that could charm anyone, he was a regular at the gallery and had become close to Tracy over the past few months. At first, I thought nothing of it. Her job required building relationships with patrons like him. But tonight, something felt different. I watched as Tracy laughed at something Jackson said, her hand lightly touching his arm. My stomach tightened. She hadn't looked at me like that in months. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I found myself watching them more closely, noticing every stolen glance, every private smile. By the time the clock struck midnight and the last of the guests were leaving, I was filled with a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. On the drive home, Tracy was uncharacteristically quiet. Normally, she would be buzzing with excitement after a successful event, talking my ear off about the details. But tonight, she stared out the window, lost in thought. When we finally got home, she kissed me on the cheek, murmured something about being tired, and went straight to bed. I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, the image of her with Jackson replaying in my mind over and over again. The days that followed the ball were a blur of unease and doubt. Tracy's behavior began to change, subtle at first, but noticeable to me. She started working late more often, claiming she had meetings or deadlines that required her attention. When she was home, she seemed distant, her mind always somewhere else. We used to talk about everything. But now our conversations were brief and stilted, filled with awkward silences. One evening, after she had gone to bed, I noticed her phone lighting up on the kitchen counter. It was a text message from Jackson. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone to read it. The message was short, just a few words, but they were enough to make my blood run cold. Can't stop thinking about last night. See you soon. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. All the unease I'd been feeling suddenly made sense. I confronted Tracy the next day while we were driving to a friend's house for dinner. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the fear and anger were clear. Tracy, what's going on between you and Jackson? She glanced at me, her eyes widening in surprise before she quickly looked away. What are you talking about? He's just a client, Nate, she said, but her voice wavered, betraying her. I wanted to believe her, but the doubt had already taken root. The drive was silent after that, both of us lost in our thoughts. By the time we arrived at our friend's house, I could barely focus on anything other than the sinking feeling in my gut. The following weekend, Tracy told me she had to go out of town for a work-related trip. She was vague about the details, saying it was something she needed to handle alone. I didn't push her, even though everything inside me screamed that she was lying. Instead, I watched her pack her bags, kiss me goodbye, and drive away, knowing full well where she was really going. The moment Tracy left, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I sat in the living room, staring at the clock, watching the minutes tick by as I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I knew where she was headed. And I knew that I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Without giving myself time to second-guess my decision, I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. I didn't have a plan. Just a desperate need to see it for myself, to confirm what I already knew in my heart. I drove the familiar route Tracy had taken so many times before, to the place she claimed she was going for work. But instead of turning off at the usual exit, I continued driving toward the outskirts of town, where Jackson Fairchild had his sprawling estate. The estate was exactly as I'd imagined, grand, secluded, with high gates that seemed to taunt anyone who dared approach. I parked a short distance away, where I could watch without being seen. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I waited, the minutes dragging by like hours. It wasn't long before I saw Tracy's car approaching. My heart pounded as she pulled up to the gate, which opened slowly to let her in. She drove through, the gate closing behind her with an ominous finality. I wanted to scream, to tear through those gates and drag her away from him. But instead, I sat there, frozen by the weight of what I was witnessing. The sun had long since set by the time I saw them again. Through the trees, I could make out the silhouettes of Tracy and Jackson walking side by side in the garden. They stopped near a bench, and I saw him take her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. I couldn't breathe. My worst fears had been confirmed, and yet seeing it with my own eyes felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I stayed there all night, watching as the lights in the house eventually dimmed and the world around me grew silent. When morning came, I saw them again, this time, as they emerged from the house together, smiling and holding hands. They looked so happy, so carefree, as if they were the only two people in the world. I waited until they drove off, Tracy's car following closely behind Jackson's, before I finally started my own car and headed home. The drive back felt like a blur. My mind was spinning with anger, betrayal, and a deep, aching sorrow that I couldn't shake. When I got home, the house felt empty. Like a hollow shell of the life we had once shared. I paced the living room, replaying the events of the night in my head, trying to make sense of it all. By the time Tracy returned that evening, I was a mess of nerves and barely contained rage. She walked through the door, her face glowing with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen in months. But as soon as she saw me, her smile faltered. "How was your weekend?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Good," she replied, too quickly. "It was productive." I studied her face, searching for any sign of guilt, but she was good at hiding it, too good. "Where exactly did you go, Tracy?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I told you, Nate. It was just work." My anger bubbled to the surface, no longer containable. "Work? Is that what you call spending the weekend with Jackson Fairchild? I saw you, Tracy. I followed you, and I saw everything." Her face went pale, and for a moment, she looked like a child caught in a lie. But then her expression hardened. And she straightened her shoulders. "So you were spying on me?" "Don't turn this around on me," I snapped, my voice rising. "You lied to me. You betrayed me, and you didn't even have the decency to admit it." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. I was too consumed by the fury that had been building up inside me for weeks. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you even care?" "I'm sorry, Nate," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never meant for it to happen this way." "But it did," I said, my voice cold. "And now what? You think you can just walk back into this house and pretend like nothing happened?" She didn't answer. Instead, she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands as the tears began to fall. I watched her for a moment, feeling nothing but a hollow emptiness where my love for her used to be. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this, Tracy," I said finally, my voice breaking. "But right now, all I want is for you to leave. I need time to think. I need time to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do next." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Please, Nate, don't do this. We can work through this, I know we can." But I shook my head, unable to even look at her anymore. "Just go, Tracy. Please." She stood up slowly, wiping the tears from her cheeks, and walked toward the door. For a moment, she paused, as if she wanted to say something more, but then she just turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. As soon as she was gone, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a ton of bricks. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands as the tears finally came. My marriage was over. My life, as I knew it, was over. And all I was left with was the bitter taste of betrayal and a burning desire for revenge. The days after Tracy left were filled with a numb, almost robotic sense of routine. I went through the motions of daily life, getting up, going to work, coming home, but everything felt hollow. The house was eerily quiet without her presence, a constant reminder of what had been lost. But underneath the numbness, there was something darker growing inside me, a simmering anger that wouldn't go away. I knew I couldn't just let her betrayal go unanswered. I needed to do something, anything, to make her feel the pain she had caused me. My first step was to take control of her finances. Tracy had always been independent when it came to money, but she wasn't as careful as she should have been. I still had access to some of her accounts from when we were managing our joint expenses. She never bothered to change the passwords after she began making more money and started handling her finances separately. She trusted me. That trust was about to cost her. I logged into her online banking one night, my heart pounding in my chest as I navigated through the various accounts. Tracy had done well for herself over the years. Her art gallery job paid handsomely, and she had invested wisely. But now, those carefully saved funds were going to serve a different purpose. I knew I had to be strategic. I couldn't just drain her accounts in one go. That would be too obvious, and she would quickly notice. Instead, I began siphoning small amounts, just enough to go unnoticed at first. A few $100s here, a few thousand there. I transferred the money into an account I had set up in a different bank under a different name. It was tedious work, but I was patient. I knew it wouldn't take long before the cumulative effect would be devastating. As I continued to chip away at her savings, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the money, it was about taking back control. Tracy had made me feel powerless when she betrayed me, but now I was the one in charge. I was the one who held the power to ruin her life, just as she had ruined mine. The financial hit wasn't the only part of my plan. I knew that to truly hurt Tracy, I needed to strike at the heart of what she cared about most, her career. The gallery was her passion. The thing that defined her. If I could take that away from her, she would be left with nothing. After several weeks of careful planning, I was ready to set the next phase of my revenge in motion. The anonymous letter was the key. I spent hours drafting it, making sure every word was carefully chosen to leave no doubt about Tracy's indiscretions. The letter was blunt, detailing her affair with Jackson Fairchild and the potential scandal it could bring to the gallery if word got out. I even attached photos I had taken of her leaving Jackson's estate that fateful morning. It was damning evidence, and I knew it would cause an uproar among the gallery's board members. Once the letter was finished, I printed it out and placed it in a plain, unmarked envelope. I mailed it directly to the gallery's owner, a woman named Margaret who had always been fond of Tracy. I knew that would make the blow even more painful when the truth was revealed. Then, all I could do was wait and watch the fallout. It didn't take long. Just a few days after I mailed the letter, Tracy came home from work looking pale and shaken. She didn't even greet me when she walked through the door, just headed straight for the bedroom. I followed her, leaning against the doorframe as I watched her frantically search through her closet, tossing clothes into a suitcase. "What's going on?" I asked, feigning concern. She didn't look at me as she spoke, her voice tight with panic. I don't know. Something happened at work. Margaret called me into her office, and she had this letter. Someone sent photos of me and Jackson. Nate. They know about the affair. I crossed my arms, keeping my expression neutral. And what did Margaret say? Tracy finally stopped packing and turned to face me, her eyes wide with fear. She said the board is furious. They're worried about how this will affect the gallery's reputation. They might fire me, Nate. I could lose everything. I stared at her, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? To see her suffer, to see her world fall apart just as mine had? But as I looked at her standing there, vulnerable and terrified, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had gone too far. "And what about Jackson?" I asked, my voice cold. She hesitated, then shook her head. "He hasn't returned my calls. I think he's trying to distance himself from me. Protect his own reputation. Of course, he was. Jackson Fairchild was a man of power and influence, someone who couldn't afford to be dragged down by a scandal. He had used Tracy, just as she had used me. But now, she was alone, facing the consequences of her actions without anyone to turn to. I took a step closer to her, my voice low and filled with barely suppressed anger. This is what happens when you betray the people who care about you, Tracy. This is the price you pay. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the nights I had spent alone, wondering where she was, what she was doing, and with whom. I remembered the gut-wrenching pain of seeing her with Jackson. The way she had smiled at him, touched him as if I didn't even exist. "Please, Nate," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But you have to help me. I can't lose my job. I can't lose everything." I stared at her, my mind racing. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where I held all the power. I could save her if I wanted to. I could call Margaret, try to smooth things over, and convince her to keep Tracy on. But why should I? She hadn't cared about my feelings when she was sneaking around with Jackson. She hadn't cared about our marriage, about the life we had built together. All she had cared about was herself. "I can't help you, Tracy," I said finally, my voice devoid of emotion. "You made this mess. Now you have to deal with the consequences." Her face crumpled as the weight of my words hit her. She sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands as the sobs racked her body. I watched her for a moment, feeling nothing but a cold, empty satisfaction. Then I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to her misery. I had done what I set out to do. I had taken everything from her, her money, her career, her reputation. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that, in the process, I had lost something too. I had lost the man I used to be, the man who would have done anything to protect the woman he loved. Now, all that was left was a hollow shell, filled with nothing but bitterness and regret. And there was no one to blame but myself. The days that followed Tracy's breakdown were a strange blend of triumph and despair. I had succeeded in bringing her to her knees, watching as she unraveled before me. Yet, the satisfaction I expected to feel was hollow. The house felt more oppressive than ever, filled with a silence that gnawed at me. Tracy avoided me, spending most of her time locked away in the bedroom, leaving only to grab something to eat or to take a call, which was becoming fewer and fewer. It was clear her world was crumbling, just as I had intended. But something was missing, something that would truly seal her fate. I needed to inflict one final blow, something so devastating that she would never recover. As I pondered this, a thought crossed my mind: Tracy's diary. She had always kept one, though she guarded it fiercely, never allowing me to even glance at it. If there was any evidence of her true feelings for Jackson, any details that might hurt her further, they would be in that diary. I waited until she went out one afternoon, claiming she needed some air. As soon as the door closed behind her, I headed to the bedroom and began searching. It didn't take long to find it, tucked away in the back of her closet, beneath a pile of old clothes. The leather-bound journal felt heavy in my hands, as if it were filled with all the secrets she had kept from me. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it, my heart pounding in anticipation. The first few entries were mundane, detailing her daily routine, her thoughts on work, and various other things that seemed insignificant now. But as I flipped through the pages, part of me wants to say yes, to just walk away from everything and be with him. But another part of me is scared of what it would mean, of what Nate would do if he found out. I'm torn between two worlds, and I don't know how to choose. I felt sick, a deep, twisting pain in my gut. Tracy had been considering leaving me for Jackson, weighing the pros and cons of abandoning our life together. But what hurt the most was the fact that she had been so conflicted, as if I were just another option. He said he wanted to be with me, but now it feels like he's pulling away. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I should have stayed with Nate. At least with him, I knew where I stood. I feel so lost, so alone. I don't know what to do anymore. I closed the diary, my hands trembling. Tracy had been on the brink of leaving me, but Jackson had pulled back, leaving her stranded in a no-man's land between the life she had and the life she wanted. It was a strange mix of emotions, anger at her betrayal, satisfaction at her suffering, and a deep, aching sadness that things had come to this. But then, an idea began to form in my mind. I had found my final weapon, the last piece of the puzzle that would destroy whatever was left of Trace's life. I carefully tore out the most incriminating pages of the diary, the ones that detailed her affair and her doubts, and set them aside. I would use them to craft a message to Jackson, something so raw and personal that he would be forced to confront the reality of their relationship. I spent the next few days crafting a letter in Trace's handwriting, copying her words verbatim from the diary, and weaving them into a narrative that would make Jackson believe she was desperate, clinging to him in a way that would disgust him. I included the most vulnerable passages, the ones where she questioned his love, and where she revealed her insecurities and fears. Then, I sealed the pages in an envelope, addressed it to Jackson, and waited. It was a warm afternoon when I saw Trace's car pull up to the house. She had been gone for hours, likely trying to clear her head after everything that had happened. As she stepped out of the car, I noticed she was carrying a small brown envelope. My heart skipped a beat. It was the letter I had sent to Jackson. The final blow was about to be delivered. She walked into the house, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She held the envelope out to me, her hand trembling. "Did you send this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at the envelope, feigning surprise. "What is it?" "Don't play dumb, Nate. It's a letter, my letter. The one you wrote pretending to be me, using my words, twisting them into something they're not." I stared at her, maintaining my calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." She threw the envelope at me, the contents spilling onto the floor. The pages of her diary, stained with her innermost thoughts and feelings, lay scattered between us. "You did this," she accused, her voice rising in anger. "You sent this to Jackson to make him hate me. To ruin whatever was left of my life." I remained silent, watching as she knelt down, gathering the pages with shaking hands. "How could you, Nate? How could you do something so cruel?" "I did what I had to do," I said coldly. "You destroyed our marriage, Tracy. You destroyed me. This was just payback." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fury and despair. "You've ruined everything. Jackson, he won't even speak to me now. He sent the letter back and told me he wanted nothing to do with me. He said I'm too unstable, too desperate. He thinks I'm pathetic." I felt a grim satisfaction at her words, but it was tempered by the realization that there was nothing left to fight for. The Tracy I had loved was gone, replaced by this broken, desperate woman who had betrayed me. And the man I had become, calculating, vengeful, cold, was a stranger even to myself. "I didn't start this, Tracy." "You did," I said, my voice hard. "You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression a mix of disbelief and resignation. Then she stood up, clutching the torn pages to her chest. "I never thought it would come to this," she whispered. "I never thought you would hurt me like this." "Neither did I replied, my voice hollow. "But here we are." Without another word, Tracy turned and walked out of the room. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, followed by the sound of a door closing softly behind her. I was left alone in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of the life we had once shared, now shattered beyond repair. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The weight of what I had done pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I had won, if you could call it that. I had destroyed Tracy, taken everything from her, just as she had taken everything from me. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt empty, like a man who had just burned down his own house to kill the rat inside.
In the darkness, I could hear Tracy crying softly in the next room.
The sound echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the life we had once shared, now reduced to ashes.
I had wanted revenge, and I had gotten it.
But in the process, I had lost myself, becoming someone I barely recognized. The next morning, Tracy was gone. She had packed her things and left without a word, leaving nothing behind but an empty closet and a hastily scrawled note. "I'm sorry, Nate.
I hope one day you can forgive me.
But I can't stay here anymore.
I can't live like this."
Dot.
I stared at the note for a long time, the words blurring before my eyes. The silence in the house was deafening, the emptiness suffocating. I had wanted revenge, and now I had it.
But at what cost?
I crumpled the note in my hand, feeling the weight of my actions bearing down on me. Tracy was gone, and with her, any chance of redemption. All that was left was a hollow victory, a life filled with regret and the bitter taste of revenge. And as I stood there, alone in the ruins of what once was,
I realized that the true cost of revenge was more than I had ever imagined.
It wasn't just Tracy who had been destroyed, it was me.
The days after Trace's departure blurred together in a fog of regret and self-loathing. The house, once a place of shared memories, felt like a tomb. Every room held a reminder of the life we had built together, now reduced to echoes of laughter that would never return. I tried to keep myself occupied, diving into work, but even that was no escape. My mind kept circling back to her. To the last look in her eyes before she walked out of the door, to the note she left behind. I thought revenge would bring closure, that it would somehow erase the pain of her betrayal. But it had only deepened the wound, leaving a hollow ache where my heart used to be. Tracy was gone, and in her absence, I was left to confront the monster I had become. I had destroyed her, yes, but in doing so, I had destroyed myself as well. One evening, I found myself in the garage, staring at the dusty old suitcase I had once used for business trips. It had been years since I'd last packed it, years since I'd needed to go anywhere. But now, the thought of staying in this house, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, was unbearable. I needed to get away, to put distance between myself and the wreckage of my life. I packed hastily, throwing clothes into the suitcase with little thought. There was no plan, no destination in mind, just the overwhelming urge to run, to leave everything behind. I grabbed my passport, some cash, and my car keys. And within minutes, I was on the road, driving aimlessly through the night. The city lights faded into the distance as I sped down the highway, my thoughts racing as fast as the car. I had no idea where I was going, and for once, I didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. Not in that house, not in that life. As the miles stretched on, the landscape changed from the concrete jungle of the city to the open expanse of the countryside. The air was different here, fresher, cleaner. Untainted by the bitterness that had consumed me. I drove through the night, only stopping once to fill up the tank and grab a coffee. The sun was beginning to rise when I finally pulled off the highway, following a sign that pointed to a small, coastal town I'd never heard of. The town was quiet, still waking up to the new day. I parked the car near the beach and got out, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filling the silence in my head. I walked along the sand, the cool breeze carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating air of the city, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I found a small, family-owned inn near the beach and checked in. The room was simple, clean, and most importantly, far away from the memories I was trying to escape. I dropped my suitcase on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with me. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the events of the past few months played out in my mind like a movie I couldn't turn off. I had lost everything, my wife, my home, my sense of self, all in the name of revenge. And now, I was alone, adrift in a sea of regret with no way back to the life I had destroyed. I thought about Tracy, wondering where she was and what she was doing. Was she as lost as I was?
Or had she found some semblance of peace in the aftermath of our destruction? I closed my eyes, hoping for sleep to take me, but it was elusive.
The guilt, the shame, the realization of what I had become, they weighed on me like a lead blanket,
suffocating any chance of rest. I rolled over, trying to push the thoughts away, but they clung to me, relentlessly.
Eventually, I got up and left the room, heading back to the beach.
The sun was higher now, casting a warm glow over the sand and water. I walked to the edge of the waves, the cool water lapping at my feet,
and stood there, staring out at the horizon.
The ocean was vast and endless, a stark reminder of how small and insignificant my problems were in the grand scheme of things.
But that did little to ease the ache in my chest.
I had to find a way to move on, to rebuild my life from the ashes of what I had destroyed.
But how? Where do you start when you've lost everything?
I spent the rest of the day walking along the beach, lost in thought.
The rhythmic sound of the waves was soothing, a steady backdrop to the chaos in my mind. By the time I returned to the inn, the sun was setting, casting a fiery orange glow over the water. I stood on the balcony outside my room, watching as the day faded into night, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. I didn't have the answers yet, I wasn't even sure what questions to ask. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this darkness. Maybe I could find a way to forgive myself, to start over. But that was a journey for another day. For now, all I could do was take it one step at a time, one day at a time, and hope that, eventually, I would find my way back to the light. The next morning, I woke up early, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains of my room. Despite the heaviness in my heart, there was something about the tranquility of this place that made it a little easier to get out of bed. I dressed quickly and headed out, determined to explore the town and clear my head. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else.
The streets were lined with quaint shops and cafes, and the locals greeted each other with warm smiles and casual conversation.
It was a far cry from the cold indifference of the city, and I found myself drawn to the simplicity of it all.
I wandered aimlessly, stopping occasionally to browse through a shop or grab a coffee.
The pace of life here was slow and unhurried, and it was exactly what I needed.
I was content to be an anonymous stranger, blending into the background, away from the mess I had left behind. It was mid-morning when I stumbled upon a small art gallery tucked away on a side street. The sign above the door read Seaside Art. And through the large windows, I could see a collection of paintings and sculptures on display. Something about the place called to me, and before I knew it, I was pushing open the door and stepping inside. The gallery was small but well curated, with a mix of local artists and more established names. The walls were adorned with vibrant paintings, each one capturing a different aspect of the coastal landscape: the sea, the sky, the people who lived and worked here. The atmosphere was quiet, almost reverent, and as I wandered through the exhibits, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. I was standing in front of a particularly striking painting, a stormy seascape, the waves crashing violently against the rocks, when a voice behind me broke the silence. "It's one of my favorites," the voice said, soft and melodic. I turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her eyes on the painting. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair that fell in loose waves around her shoulders and a warm,
inviting smile.
She was dressed simply, in jeans and a white blouse, but there was an air of quiet confidence about her that immediately drew me in. "It's powerful," I replied, turning back to the painting. "You can almost feel the wind and the spray of the water." She nodded, stepping closer.
"It's by a local artist.
He's got a real gift for capturing the raw beauty of the sea." We stood in silence for a moment, both of us lost in the painting. There was something about the woman's presence that was calming, as if she understood the storm raging inside me. "I'm Nate, by the way," I said, offering my hand. She smiled and took it.
"Claire.
It's nice to meet you, Nate."
We spent the next hour wandering through the gallery together, talking about the art, the town, and anything else that came to mind.
There was an easy rapport between us, a natural connection that made the conversation flow effortlessly. I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't with anyone in a long time, sharing bits and pieces of my life and my struggles without the usual filter of caution. Claire was a local, born and raised in the town. She had left for a while, gone to college, traveled, but she had returned a few years ago to take over the gallery after her parents retired. She spoke with a quiet passion about the community, the artists she represented, and the life she had built here. There was a contentment in her words that I envied, a sense of purpose and belonging that I had lost. As we talked, I couldn't help but notice the way Claire listened, really listened, without judgment or impatience. It was a stark contrast to the superficial conversations I had grown accustomed to in the city, where people were always distracted, always looking for the next thing. With Claire, it felt like time slowed down, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. When we finally left the gallery, the sun was high in the sky, and the town was bustling with activity. Claire suggested grabbing lunch at a nearby cafe, and I eagerly agreed. We found a quiet table on the patio, overlooking the water, and continued our conversation over sandwiches and iced tea. It wasn't long before the conversation turned more personal. Claire asked about my life and what had brought me to her town. I hesitated, the memories of the past few months still raw, but there was something in her gaze that made me want to be honest. I came here to escape, I admitted, looking out at the water. I made some mistakes, big ones, and I needed to get away, to figure out what's next. Claire nodded, her expression understanding.
Sometimes we all need to step back and reevaluate.
Life has a way of throwing us off course.
Her words hit close to home, and I found myself opening up even more, telling her about Tracy, about the affair, about the revenge that had consumed me.
I didn't go into all the details, but I shared enough for her to understand the pain and regret I was carrying. When I finished, Claire was silent for a moment, her gaze thoughtful.
"It sounds like you've been through hell,"
she finally said, her voice gentle.
"But the fact that you're here, trying to move forward, says a lot about who you are."
I looked at her, surprised by the compassion in her words. "I'm not sure who I am anymore," I confessed. "I've lost so much. I don't know if I can ever get back to the person I used to be." Claire reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. "Maybe you're not supposed to. Maybe this is your chance to become someone new, someone stronger. We're all shaped by our experiences, good and bad. The important thing is what we do with them." Her words resonated with me, offering a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had enveloped me. For the first time in months, I felt like I might be able to rebuild, to find a way out of the mess I had created. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, walking along the beach, talking, laughing. It was easy, natural, like a breath of fresh air. By the time the sun began to set, I realized that I didn't want the day to end. As we stood on the beach, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I turned to Claire, a question on the tip of my tongue. But before I could speak, she smiled and said, "I'm glad you came to Seaside, Nate. Maybe this is exactly where you're meant to be." Her words hung in the air between us, filled with possibility. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, I wasn't alone. I had found a kindred spirit in Claire, someone who understood the pain of the past but also saw the potential for the future. As we walked back to the inn, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The storm inside me had quieted, replaced by a cautious hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The days turned into weeks, and my time in Seaside became a routine of simplicity and healing. Each morning, I would wake to the sound of waves crashing against the shore, have breakfast at the inn, and then meet Claire at the gallery. We spent hours together, working side by side, talking about art, life, and everything in between. Claire was more than just a friend, she was my anchor in a sea of uncertainty. For the first time in months, I felt like I was rebuilding myself, not as the man I once was, but as someone new, someone better.
The town, with its quiet charm and easy rhythm, felt like the perfect place for that transformation.
I wasn't sure how long I would stay, but for now, Seaside was exactly where I needed to be.
But as with all things, the peace I had found was not meant to last. The past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you run. One afternoon, I was at the gallery, helping Claire set up a new exhibit when my phone buzzed in my pocket.
It was a number I didn't recognize, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But something compelled me to answer.
Nate?
A familiar voice said,
The tone hesitant, almost unsure.
I froze, my heart skipping a beat.
Tracy?
There was a long pause on the other end.
The silence heavy with unspoken words. When she finally spoke, her voice was strained, as if it took all her strength to get the words out.
I didn't think you'd pick up. I glanced over at Claire, who was busy arranging a display on the other side of the room.
She caught my eye and smiled, a warm, reassuring look that gave me the courage to continue the conversation.
What do you want, Tracy? I asked, keeping my voice as even as possible. I've been trying to reach you for weeks, she said, her voice trembling. You just disappeared. I didn't know where you went, and I needed to talk to you. I needed to get away, I replied, struggling to keep the anger and pain out of my voice. I couldn't stay in that house, Tracy.
Not after everything that happened.
I know, she said quietly. I know I hurt you, Nate. And I'm so sorry for what I did. But I need to talk to you, about us, about what happened. I need to explain.
Explain?
I echoed, feeling a surge of bitterness rise up in my chest. What's left to explain, Tracy?
You betrayed me. You lied to me. And then you left. There was another pause, and when Tracy spoke again, her voice was filled with a quiet desperation.
Please, Nate.
Just hear me out.
I need to see you, to talk in person. I'm in Seaside, I found out where you were staying.
Can we meet?
Please?
I felt like the ground had just been pulled out from under me. Tracy was here? In Seaside? The safe haven I had built for myself suddenly felt vulnerable and exposed. I wanted to tell her no, to hang up the phone and walk away from the wreckage she had brought into my life. But something in her voice, some small part of the woman I had once loved, kept me from doing that.
Fine, I said, the word coming out sharper than I intended. We can talk. But this doesn't change anything, Tracy. I understand, she said, relief evident in her tone. There's a coffee shop near the inn, the Seaside Bean. Can we meet there in an hour?
Yeah, I agreed, feeling the weight of the decision settle over me. I'll be there. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. What was I doing?
I had left that life behind for a reason, and now I was willingly walking back into it. But as much as I tried to convince myself that I didn't care, that Tracy's words didn't matter, the truth was I needed closure. I needed to understand why she had done what she did, to finally put this chapter of my life to rest.
Claire must have noticed the change in my demeanor because she walked over, concern etched on her face. Is everything okay, Nate?
Not really, I admitted, running a hand through my hair. That was Tracy. She's here. She wants to talk.
Claire's expression softened with understanding. Do you want me to come with you?
I shook my head, appreciating the offer but knowing this was something I had to face alone. No, I need to do this on my own.
But thank you.
She nodded, her eyes full of support.
If you need anything, I'm here.
I smiled, grateful for her presence in my life. I know.
With a deep breath, I left the gallery and made my way to the Seaside Bean, the weight of the past pressing heavily on my shoulders. The Seaside Bean was a cozy little cafe, with mismatched furniture and walls lined with local art.
The scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of baked goods. I pushed open the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and scanned the room until my eyes landed on her.
Tracy sat at a table in the corner, her hands wrapped around a mug, staring down into it as if it held all the answers.
She looked different, thinner, more fragile, like the weight of our shared past had taken its toll on her too.
But there was still something undeniably familiar about her, something that stirred a mix of emotions I wasn't ready to confront.
She looked up as I approached, her eyes widening with a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Nate," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. I nodded and sat down across from her, keeping my expression neutral.
"Tracy."
For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us thick with tension. I waited for her to speak, to start the conversation she had insisted on having.
But now that I was here, face to face with her, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what she had to say.
"I'm sorry," she finally whispered, her voice trembling.
"I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am for everything that happened."
"Why did you do it, Tracy?" I asked, cutting to the heart of the matter.
"Why did you betray me like that?"
She looked down at her hands, her fingers tightening around the mug. I wish I had a simple answer. I wish I could tell you that it was just a mistake, that I wasn't thinking. But the truth is, I was lost, Nate. I was unhappy, and instead of talking to you, instead of trying to fix things between us, I looked for an escape.
And when Jackson came along, offering attention and excitement,
I made the worst mistake of my life. Her words cut deep, reopening old wounds that had barely begun to heal.
"You should have talked to me," I said, my voice thick with emotion.
"We could have worked through it together. But you chose to go behind my back instead." "I know," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I thought I wanted something different, something more.
But all I did was destroy the one thing that really mattered." I stared at her, the woman I had once loved more than anything, and felt a pang of sorrow for what we had lost. But that sorrow was tempered by the anger and betrayal that still simmered beneath the surface. "Why are you here, Tracy? What do you want from me?" She wiped a tear from her cheek, her gaze pleading. "I'm not asking for us to get back together, Nate. I know that's not possible. But I couldn't move on without seeing you, without trying to explain. I needed you to know that it wasn't your fault, that you didn't do anything wrong."
"Maybe not," I said, my voice cold.
"But that doesn't change what you did.
You broke us, Tracy.
You broke me."
She flinched at my words, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty for the pain they caused. But then I remembered the months of lies, the betrayal that had nearly destroyed me, and any sympathy I felt was quickly snuffed out. "I know I did," she whispered, her voice cracking. "And I hate myself for it. But I'm trying to make things right, Nate. I'm trying to be a better person." I looked at her, searching for any sign of the woman I had once known, the woman I had loved.
But all I saw was a stranger, someone who had made choices that had torn my life apart. "What are you going to do now?" I asked, not sure why I cared but needing to know all the same.
"I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I'm going to start over somewhere new, try to rebuild my life. I needed to say goodbye."
The finality of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This was it, the end of our story, the last chapter in a book that had once been filled with so much promise.
I had thought I wanted this, to see her one last time, to get the closure I needed.
But now that it was here, all I felt was an overwhelming sense of loss. "Goodbye, Tracy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper.
She nodded, her expression a mix of sadness and acceptance. "Goodbye, Nate." And with that, she stood up, leaving the cafe and walking out of my life for good. I watched her go, feeling a strange emptiness settle over me. It was over. The chapter was closed.
But instead of feeling relief, all I felt was a hollow ache where my heart used to be.
I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me, trying to process everything that had just happened. Part of me wanted to chase after her, to demand answers to the questions that still lingered.
but another part of me knew that this was the only way forward.
Tracy was gone, and it was time for me to let go of the past and start focusing on the future.
With a deep breath, I stood up and left the cafe, stepping out into the cool evening air. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the town, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The past was behind me, and while the scars it had left would never fully heal, I knew that I had the strength to move forward.
As I walked back to the inn, I thought of Claire and the new life I was beginning to build. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face it, one step at a time.
The next few days after my meeting with Tracy passed in a blur.
I threw myself into work at the gallery, helping Claire prepare for an upcoming showcase featuring local artists.
It was a distraction, a way to keep my mind from wandering back to the emotional wreckage I had just endured.
But no matter how busy I kept myself,
Tracy's words lingered in my mind. The finality of our goodbye was something I had longed for, yet now that it had happened, it left a void inside me.
I felt like I was standing on the edge of something new, but unsure of how to step forward.
Claire, ever perceptive, noticed the change in me. One afternoon, as we were rearranging the layout of the gallery, she pulled me aside. "Nate, you've been quieter than usual," she said, her eyes full of concern. "Did something happen when you met with Tracy?"
I sighed, leaning against the wall as I searched for the right words. "It's over, Claire.
Whatever we had, whatever we were, it's done.
And I know it's for the best, but it still hurts." She nodded, understanding in her gaze.
Closure is a strange thing. We think it will make everything better, but sometimes it just leaves us with more questions.
Yeah, I agreed, running a hand through my hair. I thought seeing her would bring me peace, but now I just feel empty. Claire stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. "You're allowed to feel that way, Nate.
It's okay to mourn what you've lost, even if it was the right thing to let it go.
Healing takes time."
Her words were comforting, and I felt a warmth spread through me as I realized how much her presence in my life meant. Claire had been there for me when I needed someone the most, offering kindness and support without expecting anything in return.
And now, as I stood on the brink of a new chapter, I knew I didn't want to face it alone.
As if reading my thoughts, Claire gave me a small smile.
"I've been thinking, Nate. There's an art fair in Portland next month.
It's a big event, with artists and galleries from all over the country.
I was planning on going to represent the gallery, but I could use some help."
What do you think? The offer took me by surprise, but as soon as she mentioned it, I felt a spark of excitement.
Portland was only a few hours away, but it represented something new, a step outside the small bubble I had created in Seaside. "I'd love to," I said, smiling back at her. "It sounds like a great opportunity." "Good," she replied, her smile widening. "We'll make a great team. Plus, it'll be a nice change of scenery." As we continued to discuss the details of the trip, I felt a renewed sense of purpose.
The past was still a part of me, but it didn't have to define me.
There was a future waiting, one that was beginning to take shape in ways I hadn't expected. And with Claire by my side, I felt ready to embrace it.
The weeks leading up to the Portland Art Fair were busy, filled with preparations and planning.
Claire and I worked tirelessly, selecting pieces from the gallery's collection, coordinating with the event organizers, and fine-tuning our presentation.
The more time I spent with her, the more I appreciated her dedication and passion for what she did.
It was infectious, and I found myself looking forward to the trip more and more each day. When the day finally arrived, we packed up the van with the selected artwork and set off early in the morning.
The drive to Portland was scenic, the coastal road offering stunning views of the ocean on one side and lush forests on the other.
Claire and I chatted easily, the conversation flowing naturally as we talked about everything from art to life in Seaside.
As we approached the city, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nerves.
Portland was a much larger stage than I was used to, and while I was confident in my abilities, there was a part of me that wondered if I was ready for this next step.
Claire must have sensed my apprehension because she glanced over at me with a reassuring smile. "You're going to do great, Nate.
We've prepared well, and you've got a good eye for this kind of work."
Just trust yourself."
"Thanks, Claire," I replied, grateful for her confidence in me.
"I'll do my best." The art fair was held in a sprawling convention center, with rows upon rows of booths showcasing everything from paintings to sculptures to mixed media installations.
The energy in the air was electric, with artists, collectors, and enthusiasts all mingling together in a celebration of creativity.
As we set up our booth, I was struck by the diversity of the art around us. There was something for everyone, from the avant-garde to the traditional, and it was clear that this was a place where ideas and innovation thrive.
Over the next few days, Claire and I worked side by side, engaging with visitors, discussing the pieces we had brought, and making connections with other galleries and artists. It was exhilarating, and I found myself completely absorbed in the experience.
But amidst the hustle and bustle, there were quiet moments too, moments where Claire and I would step away from the booth, grab a coffee, and talk about our dreams and aspirations.
She told me about her plans to expand the gallery's reach, to bring more attention to the talented but underrepresented artists in the region. I shared my thoughts on curating my own collection one day, perhaps even opening a gallery of my own.
It was in those moments that I realized just how much my life had changed since I first arrived in Seaside.
I was no longer the man who had fled from his problems, consumed by anger and betrayal. I had found a new path, one that was filled with possibilities and, more importantly, hope. On the final day of the fair, as we were packing up, Claire turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Nate, have you ever thought about staying in Seaside permanently?" The question caught me off guard.
But as I considered it, I realized that the idea wasn't as surprising as I might have thought.
Seaside had become more than just a place of refuge. It had become a place where I could see myself building a future. I admitted, meeting her gaze. "In fact, I've been thinking about it a lot lately."
"This place, it feels like home."
Claire smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "I'm glad to hear that. Seaside could use someone like you, someone with your talent and vision. And I could use a partner at the gallery.
Someone to help take it to the next level." The offer hung in the air between us, filled with promise. It was more than just a job. It was a chance to start over, to create something meaningful alongside someone who had become incredibly important to me.
"I'd like that, Claire," I said, my voice steady with conviction. "I'd like that a lot." As we finished packing and loaded the van, I felt a sense of peace settle over me.
The past was behind me, but it had led me to this moment, a moment where I could see a future that was bright and full of potential. And as we drove back to Seaside, with the sun setting on the horizon, I knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter in my life was unfolding, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace it with open arms.
The weeks after the art fair in Portland seemed to pass in a blur. Seaside had taken on a new meaning for me, no longer just a refuge but a place where I could truly see myself building a life. Claire and I grew closer each day, not just as colleagues but as something more. We spent our days immersed in the gallery, working on new projects and brainstorming ideas for future exhibits.
At night, we would walk along the beach, talking about everything and nothing, letting the sound of the waves fill the silence between us.
It wasn't long before Claire's offer to become her partner at the gallery became a reality. We signed the papers together, solidifying our professional relationship and setting the stage for what would be an exciting new chapter for both of us. The gallery had always been Claire's passion, but now it was becoming mine too. I found myself invested in its success in a way I hadn't expected, eager to bring new artists to light and make the gallery a cornerstone of the community. One evening, after a particularly long day of setting up a new exhibit, Claire and I sat on the porch of her small cottage, a bottle of wine between us. The sky was a deep shade of purple, the last rays of the sun dipping below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the water. "I can't believe how much has changed in such a short time," I said, taking a sip of my wine. When I first came here, I didn't think I'd be staying more than a few days.
Now, I can't imagine being anywhere else.
Claire smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft light of the setting sun. Life has a funny way of surprising us.
I'm glad you decided to stay, Nate.
The gallery wouldn't be the same without you. Her words filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. I'm glad too.
This place, it's become home for me.
And you've been a big part of that, Claire.
There was a brief silence, the kind that felt comfortable, where no words were necessary. But then Claire turned to me, her expression serious, as if she had been holding something back.
Nate, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about, she said, her voice soft. I've been thinking a lot about what's next for us, for the gallery, for you and me.
I felt a knot of anticipation tighten in my chest.
Unsure of where this conversation was headed but knowing it was important.
What is it?
She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. I know we've been focused on the gallery, and I love what we're building together. But I think it's time we talked about what's happening between us, personally.
We've both been through a lot, and I don't want to rush into anything, but I also don't want to ignore what's right in front of us.
My heart raced as I realized where she was going with this.
The connection between us had been undeniable from the start, but neither of us had put it into words, perhaps out of fear or uncertainty. But now, hearing her say it out loud, I knew I felt the same. You're right, I said, my voice steady despite the nervousness I felt.
We have something special, Claire. And I don't want to lose that.
But I also don't want to mess it up by moving too fast.
Claire nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. I feel the same way. We've both been through a lot of pain.
And I think we need to be careful with each other, to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next.
I reached out, taking her hand in mine, feeling the warmth of her skin against mine. I'm willing to take that chance, Claire. Whatever happens, I want to see where this goes, with you.
Her smile widened, and she squeezed my hand gently.
Me too, Nate.
We don't have to figure everything out right now.
Let's just take it one day at a time, and see where it leads us. As we sat there,
hand in hand, watching the last light fade from the sky, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The past had been painful, filled with betrayal and loss, but it had also led me here, to this moment. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with everything that had happened, ready to embrace whatever the future held. In the days and weeks that followed, Claire and I continued to build our life together, both in the gallery and outside of it.
We were partners in every sense of the word.
Supporting each other, challenging each other, and finding joy in the simple moments we shared.
Seaside had become more than just a place for me. It was where I had found myself again, where I had discovered what really mattered.
As I stood on the beach one evening, watching the waves roll in, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that I was excited to write with Claire by my side.
Whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them. Because for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I was meant to be. And that was more than enough.